Marty stood up from his favorite spot on the bench at a local park. It had been 3 years since he started coming to this park after he retired. With nothing much to do at home, he decided to venture outside and found a lovely spot at the park, an old wooden bench just beneath a huge, beautiful tree. Since then, he could be found at that spot every afternoon, resting comfortably while he watches the people who pass him by. There was also a young boy who would sit with him from time to time and exchange stories with him or simply keep him company. But he was not there today. This particular afternoon, the air was humid, so he decided to start his walk back home earlier than usual. As he approached his block, he noticed a thick cloud of smoke as it moved heavenward. People were gathered on the street as they watched the fire. Marty suddenly felt his body slowly fill with dread as he walked briskly towards his house. And when he stopped a few houses over, his heart dropped to his toes as he watched the house burn to the ground. It was a nice house too, once filled with life and laughter before his wife died and his 2 children moved out to build a family and a house of their own. It was the house painstakingly built from him and his wife's meager salaries as bank teller and office receptionist respectively. Although it was quite small compared to the others on the block, they were proud of it and lived happily in it. There were so many good memories in that house that he decided to stay despite the empty feeling without his wife and children there. And that very house was now crumbling to the ground, slowly turning to ash as he watched. He didn't even realize that tears were falling from his eyes until Richard lightly tapped his shoulder to express support. At the next moment, Richard's wife Margaret offered him a packet of tissues as she looked at him with compassionate eyes. She knew how invaluable the house was for Marty. His eyes would always light up whenever he spoke of their memories there. Now, those same eyes are brimming with tears as he loses the last thing and place he still feels connected to his departed wife. The trio stood silently and watched as the fire department fought a losing battle against the roaring fire. A few minutes later, Chief Stanley of the fire department approached them with a solemn look in his face. Like Richard and Margaret, Stanley knew how important the house was to Marty, not only because of its memories, but also because it was the only place he could still call home. "I'm sorry, Marty. It appears that a cigarette butt caused all of this destruction," Chief Stanley said. He nodded his head, but otherwise remained stoically silent. "You can bunk with us until the weekend," Richard said. "But after that," he trailed off. Richard and Margaret were moving closer to their daughter and new grandbaby and were just wrapping things up. The house had already been sold, and the new owners will move in once they leave. "Would you perhaps want to come with us to the countryside, Marty?" Margaret asked. Marty didn't appear to comprehend what they were saying as he continued to stare at the pile of debris, which used to be his home. "Come on, pal. Let's get you settled inside, and then as soon as Stanley gives the go-ahead, we'll go over to the house," Richard said as he nodded his head meaningfully to the fire chief. Stanley nodded in understanding. The widowed old man needed to go to the house and see if there was anything that he could salvage. "We'll be out of your hair in a few more hours," Stanley said as he walked towards his crews, who were still trying to put out blazing embers here and there. Inside Richard's house, Marty stationed himself by the window. Others would think he was just deep in thought, given how silent and quiet he was. However, Richard had known him for years, and it concerned him that his friend was staring vacantly at the house next door, or what was left of it. "Do you want to call Colin or Amanda?" Margaret inquired softly. But Marty remained quiet, as if he didn't hear her speak at all. Richard caught his wife's eyes and shook his head. They decided to let him grieve the loss of his home. By morning, everyone went back to the normalcy of their lives, except Marty, who forced himself to face the ruins of his home. Richard was right beside him when he moved from one room to another as he tried to look for anything of importance that he could keep. He walked to what used to be the living room, the part of the house that sustained a little less damage than other parts of the house. He dropped to his knees as he reached for an old milk crate that contained all the family pictures. Miraculously, the photos were left untouched. The crate itself reeked of smoke, but showed no sign of being almost burned to ash by the fire. He then continued to browse through the rooms, or what was left of them, and looked for anything worth keeping. His clothes all turned to ash, and his books faced the same horrid fate, just like the other stuff in the house. Everything he was able to salvage fit into an old suitcase a neighbor gave him. The others gave him clothes, jackets, shoes, and blankets. Marty barely said anything, which bothered and worried Richard and Margaret. They wanted to bring their friend along with them on their trip, but it didn't even seem that he had a clear grasp of what was happening around him. He would often stare at nothingness, retreating to himself. Richard was discussing their options as to how to help their friend when they heard a knock. When Margaret opened the door, she was greeted by a polished and rich-looking couple with a lanky teen behind them. "May we come in? We have to tell you something about the fire," the man said. They were escorted inside as Richard and Margaret listened to what they had to say. Meanwhile, Marty was back at the park with a chaotic mind and an empty heart. When it started to get dark, he walked towards Richard's home and noticed a sleek black car parked outside. Curious, he bounded up the steps and knocked. "There he is!" Richard said in a loud voice. Confused, he let himself be led inside. On the couch sat a well-known businessman and his lawyer wife beside him. Marty scanned the room and saw the boy slouching on one of the chairs. He instantly smiled when he recognized him. "Carter, what are you doing here?" he asked the boy who would usually sit beside him at the park. It was one of the things he always looked forward to doing at the park, exchanging stories with Carter. 6 months ago, Carter was walking his dog when it made his way to where he was sitting. He stayed for a while since the dog didn't seem to want to leave the old man's side, and since he has been seeing him there every afternoon, he didn't think it was unsafe. Since then, their friendship blossomed. The boy was mild-mannered and had kind eyes. He told him of his dreams and frustrations. They had built a bond in the few weeks they spent the afternoons together at the park. For his part, Carter was a lonely boy, despite having rich parents. His parents were always so busy with their work that they barely spent time with him. So, when he met Marty at the park and became friends with him, he was glad. "Marty!" Carter looked up in surprise. "Do you know each other?" asked Margaret. "Well, he's my best friend," Marty said as he winked at Carter, and the boy grinned in response. "What a small world," the lawyer murmured. "We're Carter's parents," said the businessman. "And he just told us this morning what he did, or at least what he didn't, and it involves you." Marty looked at them quizzically, and his gaze landed on Carter. He saw emotions settle on the young man's face. Curiosity, realization, fear, then regret. He saw all these before Carter dropped his gaze to the floor. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, Carter confided that his so-called friends convinced him to try out cigarettes while they were on the way to wherever they hang out these days. Anyway, Carter didn't want to, and he threw away the cigarette handed to him. The other boys didn't like that and wanted to make him pay for his defiance. So he ran," the businessman intoned. As if it were rehearsed, or maybe it was just the ease of being together for years, his wife continued the story. Carter didn't realize he unintentionally started a fire and only found out this morning when he passed the house while walking the dog. He came to us immediately and explained what happened. "I'm sorry for this, Marty. We promise to compensate you for what you've lost." He was silent for a long moment. Carter remained seated on the couch, but he sat very still, as if the adults would forget he was even there if he didn't move at all. When the silence stretched too long and became uncomfortable for a young boy, he cautiously lifted his gaze and realized that this older friend was looking straight at him. "I'm sorry, Marty," he blurted out. "I didn't know it would cause a fire. I'm really sorry." The old man remained still. He didn't expect this was what Carter's family had come for. He loved the boy like a grandson, but the home he lost housed his family's memories, and it all burned to the ground, literally, because of the boy. Even if he didn't mean it, that was the result of his action. Everyone remained quiet as he stood in stoic silence. He thought of his wife's happy face whenever she prepared dinner for the family. He thought of Colin and Amanda when they took their first step in the living room. Now those places that reminded him of those special moments were no longer there. Then he remembered his wife's passing. Amanda and Colin went back to their families, and he was left to his own devices. Then he met Carter at the park, who eased most of his loneliness. He lifted his gaze and said, "That was a brave thing you did, Carter." This surprised everyone. Carter's eyes widened in surprise. Did Marty lose his mind after he lost his house? Carter thought to himself. Not a lot of kids would admit their faults, especially as big as this one, especially since it could have enormous consequences, Marty continued. "So does this mean you'll press charges?" Carter's mum asked, with a straight shoulder as if ready to go to battle. "Press charges against a child? And my best friend at that? No, I don't think so." he answered lightly. Really? Carter blurted out. He still didn't understand why his friend was so calm about this. Yes, really, he said indulgently. You didn't mean for it to happen and you're sorry. You were courageous and ready to own up to your mistakes. That's good enough for me. We would still like to compensate you though, Carter's father said. Richard mentioned that they were leaving in a few days and you have nowhere to go. We could give you enough for a small apartment. That won't be necessary, he replied. I already made my mind up to look for jobs. Maybe you can be my tutor, Carter piped up. Mum was just telling me the other day that I suck at math and that I better pull myself together, or she won't buy me this new game I've had my eye on for months. You told me you were a banker, right? Carter rambled on as he got more excited about the idea. That must mean you're smart, especially at math. I overheard Dad telling Mom that I'd probably do better with a tutor. So I think that works, right, Mom, Dad? Well, that's true, but remember that you were the one who told the world you sucked at math when your father and I kept your secret, Carter's mother joked. I do think that's a great idea. In fact, if you don't want to accept any compensation from us, you can just work for us as Carter's tutor, and you can live in one of our staff houses available to our employees, Carter's dad said. What do you say? Can you please be my tutor? If you move away, I'll never find out what happened to the soldier and the singer, Carter chattered as Marty laughed at the boy's enthusiasm. I'll think about it, and thanks for the offer. Marty shook hands with Carter's parents before they turned to leave. He liked the idea, as he was very fond of Carter. The boy was very lively, and his exuberant energy was contagious. The next 2 days, Carter was at Richard's place convincing Marty to be his tutor and to live near him. With Carter's unwavering insistence and persistence, Marty finally agreed to pick up the pieces of his life and start a new chapter with this very lively boy, who had been a very good friend and companion to him over the last few months. And now, it appears that Carter has once again saved him from a pit of loneliness.